Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Willow had never imagined that what should have been the most beautiful day of her life would mark the beginning of a psychological nightmare, an endless descent into darkness where she became nothing more than a puppet tangled in the invisible strings of a man she once trusted with her heart. As she stepped into the chapel adorned in her pristine white wedding gown, her face was blank, her eyes vacant. There was no joy, no anticipation, only the heavy numbness of submission. That hollow expression masked a soul in ruins. The moment Nina, her mother, confessed to a prolonged affair with Drew, the very man Willow believed she would spend the rest of her life with, something inside her fractured beyond repair. The betrayal struck like a blade, not only because of Drew's deceit, but because Nina had stood silently on the sidelines, letting her daughter walk blindly into a marriage rooted in manipulation and lustful betrayal. And yet, that devastating moment was only the opening act of a far more sinister play. In the hours that followed the ceremony, as guests lingered and false smiles masked hidden truths, Willow quietly packed a small bag, her hands trembling with the urgency of escape. Her heart pounded with equal parts dread and hope. She had no clear destination, only one instinct, survival. But just as she slipped toward the door, the nightmare took form. Drew stood there, his face stripped of affection, replaced with the chilling calm of a predator who knew he held every card. His grip on her wrist was tight, his voice cold and deliberate as he delivered the threat that would shatter what little remained of her resolve. If she dared to leave, if she dared to tell anyone the truth, he would go to the authorities with evidence that she had once kidnapped Daisy. He would destroy her in front of Michael and Sasha, expose her darkest shame, and ensure that she would never be allowed near her child again. It was a psychological prison crafted with precision, and Willow now understood that Drew's control extended beyond manipulation. He was prepared to annihilate her. She had no place to run, no one to turn to. She was forced to exist in his world, trapped in a cold and loveless house with the man who had violated her trust, seduced her mother, and was systematically dismantling the Corinthos family from within. Every room in their home echoed with deceit. She was no longer a partner in this marriage, she was a hostage of secrets. But what haunted Willow even more than Drew's betrayal was the silent complicity of her mother. Nina had looked her daughter in the eyes, watched her don the veil, watched her walk toward an altar built on lies, and said nothing. The silence, the cowardice, the willingness to protect her own guilt rather than her daughter's future, it all struck Willow harder than any confession ever could. It was as though she'd been orphaned again, this time not by death, but by willful abandonment. Still, even as despair rooted itself deep in her soul, something within Willow ignited. The deeper the darkness grew, the more fiercely the flame inside her burned. She was done being prey. Every night, when Drew was asleep, she meticulously recorded every detail, every phone call, every document she could access. She discovered that Drew had orchestrated a falsified drug test to ruin Michael's credibility in court. She overheard hushed conversations with Sidwell about siphoning funds from the hospital's charitable wing into private offshore accounts. Drew was not just a manipulator, he was a criminal, a man so corrupted by power and greed that he would poison the very people who had once believed in him. With every new discovery, Willow shed another layer of fear. She reached out to Carly through subtle hints, planting questions, gently pointing her toward discrepancies in Drew's financial dealings. She made covert contact with Liesel, asking her to quietly investigate medical records and cross-reference dates that Drew had tried to cover up. Bit by bit, she pieced together a web of corruption, each thread tightening around Drew's empire of lies. And as she watched him move through their life with the mask of a doting husband, the revulsion inside her grew. The thought of every intimate moment they had shared now made her skin crawl. She could feel his touch lingering like poison, and she fought to keep from visibly recoiling whenever he looked at her with that counterfeit warmth. He didn't love her. He never did. She had merely been a means to an end, someone to disarm Michael, to claim Wiley, to gain the public image of a devoted family man while conducting his schemes under the radar. But Willow was no longer the naive woman who had believed in second chances. Her pain had matured into precision. Her rage had been tempered into resilience. She began building a counterattack, not just to escape, but to demolish Drew entirely. She created a shell organization that mimicked a children's charity and began transferring small sums of Drew's laundered money into it, knowing it would trigger attention once the balances spiked. She anonymously tipped a local reporter to dig into hospital accounts. She tracked Drew's movements, noting every late-night meeting, every unexplained trip, every phone call to Portia that he insisted was professional. In time, Willow would have everything she needed. The evidence, the testimony, the financial trail, it was all coalescing into a strategy, one built not on impulse, but on methodical dismantling. She would not scream. She would not run. She would destroy him in silence, with patience, and with the same ruthlessness he had used against her. This time, she would be the architect of his downfall. She was done mourning. Done begging. Done breaking. Willow would rise from the ashes of the life Drew tried to bury her in. Not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a force he would never see coming. The day she walked into that chapel, she thought she was walking into a marriage. But now she understood, she had walked into war. And she would win. Willow had been living a double life, one forged by necessity, sharpened by trauma, and sustained by the quiet fire of revenge. On the surface, she was the dutiful wife, walking the halls of their home with forced grace, playing the part Drew expected her to play. But beneath that carefully composed exterior, her mind was a weapon in constant motion, engineering his downfall with the same meticulous precision he had once used to control her. She had suffered humiliation, betrayal, and spiritual imprisonment, but she had never stopped watching, never stopped listening, and, most importantly, never stopped planning. Her days were scripted, her nights were rehearsed, and every breath she took was a thread woven into the complex tapestry of destruction she was slowly spinning around Drew Kane. Her first move had been subtle, the redirection of ownership of 3 of Drew's most discreet offshore accounts. She had discovered them through months of observation, watching Drew log into a seldom-used laptop during late-night phone calls with Sidwell. He always assumed she was asleep, and when he grew careless, he left the device open. Willow memorized the credentials in seconds. It was enough. Using an encrypted virtual machine access through a library computer under a fake login, she created a non-existent charitable foundation, the Fair Futures Initiative, a name innocent enough to escape scrutiny but constructed to trigger alarms among financial investigators once enough funds passed through. Drew never noticed. The man was too arrogant to imagine the woman he viewed as broken could beat him at his own game. Her second move was the acquisition of incriminating material. Knowing Drew kept his meetings with Portia and Sidwell off the record, Willow turned to the only person capable of breaching the hospital's secure communications without leaving a trace, Spinelli. It took weeks of coded messages, planted within seemingly random files hidden in the metadata of hospital newsletters, but he finally responded. Willow didn't need to say much. Spinelli had known her long enough to recognize distress veiled behind digital masks. He hacked into the backup server of the hospital's audio surveillance, a feature recently installed to enhance patient safety. And unearthed a damning recording in which Drew not only blackmailed Portia into falsifying a drug test but also implicated several board members as being complicit in laundering donation money through multiple fronts. The clip alone was enough to warrant a federal investigation. But Willow knew that a federal case would take time, too much time. She needed Drew to suffer now. So, she weaponized the very emotion that Drew thought had withered inside her, family. She found a way to reach Nina, not to reconcile but to manipulate her guilt. She recalled every conversation they had in the past where Nina's voice cracked at the mention of regret, how she had longed for Nellie, grieved over lost chances, and sought redemption through motherly atonement. Willow drafted a letter, neutral in tone but heavy in implication. She used phrases Drew had whispered to Nina during their affair, intimate words he foolishly repeated to Willow while drunk one night. She packaged them within the anonymous note and slipped it into a book at the Metro Court, The Bell Jar, one of Nina's favorites. A week later, Willow watched from the lounge as Nina opened the book and froze. Her hands trembled. Her eyes darted. And in that moment, Willow knew the transformation had begun. She had planted doubt in a woman consumed by guilt, and doubt, like rot, spreads quietly. Meanwhile, inside her prison-like existence, Willow built her escape route in the form of secret journal entries masked as harmless parenting tips and medical research, sent as encrypted emails to Sasha. Each one included veiled messages, timelines, and carefully embedded metadata outlining her plight. To the uninformed eye, they were benign documents, but Sasha, who had survived her own spiral through loss and gaslighting, would see the cries for help buried beneath clinical phrasing and digital misdirection. The Willow she once knew was gone, but what remained was someone fighting from within a nightmare, desperately throwing breadcrumbs back toward the real world. Drew had grown cocky. He believed his mask was still intact. He walked into board meetings with confidence, greeted Port Charles residents with practiced warmth, and whispered lies into the ears of those he thought were loyal. But whispers become winds, and Willow had begun turning those winds into a storm. Carly had started noticing small inconsistencies in Drew's foundation reports. Liesl had grown suspicious about the gaps in Portia's recent prescriptions and consultations. Nina, once blind, had begun keeping her distance. The structure was weakening. The mirrors were cracking. And Drew didn't even see it. As the pressure mounted, Willow feigned deeper submission. She played the part so well that Drew relaxed his guard. He began leaving his phone unattended. He stopped checking her browser history. He even allowed her to attend charity functions alone, never once suspecting that every time she stepped out, she was one step closer to ending him. She traced his funds. She cross-referenced his clients. She collected voice memos, text backups, even voice-to-text errors that could be misconstrued by the right prosecutor. She partnered silently with Liesl, passing her the transcript of a conversation between Drew and Sidwell involving shifting liability for pediatric opioid prescriptions, a scandal waiting to explode. And with every move, Willow didn't just isolate Drew. She rewrote the narrative he had built about her. The docile wife. Gone. The grieving daughter. Dead. In her place stood a woman reborn in vengeance, armed with truth and timing. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to scream. She was going to watch. Watch as Drew's accounts froze. Watch as reporters hounded him. Watch as board members turned their backs. Watch as Nina refused his calls. Watch as Portia broke under the weight of guilt. Watch as Carly demanded answers. Watch as Sasha confronted him with everything she knew. And most of all, Willow would watch as Drew's smile faded when he realized that she was the one who dismantled him piece by piece. One night soon, he would wake up and find his world inverted. Subpoenas on the doorstep. Investigators waiting. Allies gone. And Willow? She would be standing by the window, sipping tea, dressed in white again, not as a bride, but as the storm that swallowed him whole. Because in the end, Drew hadn't just underestimated Willow, he had created her. And the monster he birthed in secrecy would be the very hand that cast him into ruin. This was no longer a war of hearts, no longer a battle waged for affection or familial restoration. This was a war of existence, of reclaiming a soul that had been dissected and buried beneath layers of coercion, manipulation, and psychological warfare. It was no longer about loving or hating Drew, it was about obliterating everything he stood for, everything he built on lies and domination. The battlefield was no longer their marriage or their home, but the twisted legacy of control Drew had forced upon her. What Willow now pursued was more than freedom. It was redefinition. It was resurrection. She would not just walk away. She would rise. For too long, Willow had been silenced by fear. Fear of being exposed, fear of losing her child, fear of disappointing those around her. But fear was no longer her captor. Now it was her fuel. And as each layer of Drew's deception unraveled before her, she felt her power returning, not as some emotional catharsis, but as a cold, clear truth. She was stronger than him. She always had been. It wasn't Drew's manipulation that had made her stay, it was her patience. She had played the long game, endured the suffocating days and nights, counting each calculated breath as preparation for the final blow. Drew had made one fatal error. He believed that control was equivalent to loyalty. He believed that if he kept her caged, dependent, isolated, she would eventually forget what it meant to fight back. But Willow had never forgotten. Every moment of compliance had been performance. Every smile at social events, every soft word at family dinners, every fake promise of forgiveness was a chess move, positioning her closer to checkmate. She had mastered the art of surviving in plain sight, gathering information with the precision of a trained operative. Drew's passwords, business associates, hidden accounts, encrypted communications, she had unearthed them all. She knew the names of his shell companies, the times of his off-record meetings, and the identities of the lawyers who specialized in white-collar crime cover-ups. She knew he had been siphoning money from the hospital's foundation fund, laundering it through foreign charities under the guise of pediatric cancer initiatives. She knew he had doctored Portia's records, pressured Sidwell into blackmailing board members, and even considered having Sasha committed to a mental facility under false claims just to silence her suspicions. This was no longer emotional betrayal, it was criminal enterprise, and Willow held the map to its core. Yet her most powerful weapon wasn't evidence or strategy. It was the emotional leverage she now wielded over the very people Drew believed were still loyal to him. Carly, once charmed by Drew's public persona, had begun to question his integrity thanks to Willow's careful disclosures about inconsistencies in Drew's philanthropic claims. Liesel, whose trust was never easily won, had been presented with transcripts of Drew's manipulation of hospital data, recordings Spinelli helped extract. Sasha had begun connecting dots between Willow's encrypted journal entries and Drew's actions. And even Nina, the mother who betrayed her in the most intimate way, was unraveling emotionally, consumed by guilt and the slow-burning horror that she had allowed her daughter to marry a sociopath. Willow used all of it, not to gain sympathy, but to build a coalition of doubt. A coalition of people who, when the time came, would not protect Drew. He would be alone when it mattered most, not because she told them to abandon him, but because he had made himself unworthy of their loyalty. And when the truth exploded into the public sphere, he would find no shield, no advocate, no one to believe him over the hard, irrefutable evidence Willow had spent months assembling. And as she stood in the shadows, watching it all take shape, the slow erosion of Drew's power, the tightening of the net she'd cast, Willow didn't feel rage. She didn't even feel satisfaction. What she felt was peace. Cold, quiet, permanent peace. The kind that only comes when a survivor finally realizes the worst is behind them, and the future, while still scarred, is finally theirs to shape. The day Drew's world fell apart would begin like any other. He would wake to emails about suspicious activity in his foundation. He would dismiss them, confident it was a glitch. Hours later, he would find Carly in his office with printouts of unauthorized wire transfers. He would see Portia crying outside the hospital boardroom. He would try to reach Nina, only to hear that she had left town with no forwarding address. By noon, an investigative journalist would release a story exposing the multi-tiered fraud linked to his name. By afternoon, Sasha would arrive, not to plead, but to accuse. And by evening, he would find a stack of papers on the kitchen table, divorce documents, custody filings, statements from Liesel, Spinelli, and even Scout's school counselor. And Willow? She would not be there to watch the collapse. She had already left, her absence louder than any confrontation could ever be. She would be living in a small home across town, one she had quietly purchased months prior under her maiden name. She would be meeting with lawyers, ready to take back not only her autonomy but full custody of Scout. She would walk freely again, her spine straight, her voice unshaking. No more hiding. No more code switching to survive. No more biting her tongue to keep the peace. This war had not ended in bloodshed or violence. It had ended with truth, and that, for someone like Drew, was the most devastating blow of all. Because while bruises heal and reputations can be rebuilt, truth, once revealed, can never be buried again. And Drew's truth was ugly, rotten, and terminal. Willow's greatest victory wasn't just in surviving Drew. It was in destroying the illusion he had built, that he was untouchable, adored, and righteous. She burned that illusion to ash, not with anger, but with clarity. And from those ashes, she rose, not as a bride, not as a victim, but as a woman who had been caged, stripped, and silenced, yet never extinguished. She was the storm that came after the silence. And when history remembered Drew Kane, it wouldn't be for his wealth or status. It would be as the man who was undone by the woman he tried to break, the woman he underestimated, the woman who walked away while his empire burned behind her. In the end, what began as a story of betrayal and captivity transformed into a saga of ruthless rebirth. Willow, once dismissed as fragile, emerged not only as a survivor but as the silent architect of justice. Her vengeance had not been loud or dramatic, it had been methodical, patient, and devastatingly complete. She had turned her pain into a blueprint, her trauma into leverage, and her silence into strategy. Drew, so certain of his dominance, so confident in his manipulations, had failed to realize that the very woman he sought to imprison had evolved into his greatest threat.